Her hand pressed to her reddened cheek. The man who had struck her, tall, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of arrogance that money bought, stepped closer with menacing intent. "You embarrassed me in there." "Rebecca," the man hissed, his voice carrying across the tarmac. "Questioning my business decisions in front of the investors after everything I've given you." Frank's military instincts screamed at him to intervene, but he forced himself to remain still. He recognized the woman now, his daughter Becca, though she looked nothing like the confident marketing executive she had been 3 years ago. Her designer clothes couldn't hide how thin she'd become, except for the obvious pregnancy bump. 7 months along, if his calculations were correct. "Jonathan, please," Becca whispered, glancing around at the ground crew who had stopped their work to stare. "People are watching. Let them watch," Jonathan Blackwood snarled. "Maybe they'll learn what happens when you disrespect your husband." Frank's jaw clenched. He'd been working as an aircraft mechanic at this private airfield for 6 months, ever since he'd discovered how badly his daughter's marriage had deteriorated. She didn't know he was here, thought he was still working at the commercial airport across town. But a father's protective instincts had led him to take this job, to be close enough to help when she needed it. And from the looks of things, that time was now. Jonathan grabbed Becca's arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Get on the plane. We're leaving for Miami whether you like it or not." "The doctor said I shouldn't fly," Becca protested weakly. The baby will be fine. You're being dramatic." "As usual." Frank started walking toward them, his military bearing automatically taking over, despite his mechanic's coveralls. Several other ground crew members had noticed the commotion, but they hung back uncertainly. Rich people's problems weren't their concern, except this rich woman was Frank Sullivan's only child. "Excuse me, sir," Frank called out in the calm, authoritative voice he'd perfected during 28 years of Air Force service. "Is everything all right over here?" Jonathan barely glanced at him. "Everything's fine. Just a domestic disagreement. Nothing that concerns the help." The dismissive tone made Frank's eyes narrow, but he kept his expression neutral. "Well, I couldn't help but notice the lady seems distressed. Company policy requires us to ensure all passengers are comfortable before takeoff." "Company policy?" Jonathan laughed harshly. "Do you know who I am? I own 3 planes at this facility. Your company policy doesn't apply to me." Frank stepped closer, noting how Becca's eyes widened as she got a better look at him. Recognition flickered across her face, quickly followed by confusion and fear. Not of him, but for him. She knew her father wouldn't back down from a fight, and she'd learned the hard way what happened to people who crossed her millionaire husband. "Sir, I understand you're an important client," Frank said evenly, "but federal aviation regulations require all passengers to board aircraft voluntarily and without duress. If the lady doesn't want to fly today—" "The lady is my wife," Jonathan snapped, "and she'll do what I tell her to do. Now step aside before I have you fired." Frank didn't move. Instead, he looked directly at Becca, his weathered face softening with paternal concern. "Ma'am, do you want to board this aircraft today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Becca's eyes filled with tears as she looked between her father and her husband. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. "She doesn't need to answer to you," Jonathan said, his face reddening. "Rebecca, get on the plane. Now." Becca started, then stopped. Frank could see the war raging in her eyes, the desperate desire for help battling against years of conditioning that had taught her to submit, to not make waves, to protect others from Jonathan's wrath. "I'm fine," she finally whispered, the lie obvious to everyone present. "I'll go." Frank's heart broke as he watched his daughter sacrifice her safety once again, but he couldn't blow his cover. Not yet. Instead, he stepped aside, giving them a clear path to the aircraft stairs. "Very good, sir," he said formally. "Have a safe flight." As Jonathan practically dragged Becca toward the plane, she looked back over her shoulder at Frank. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he saw her mouth a single word. "Daddy." He gave her the slightest nod, just enough to let her know he understood. Then she was gone, disappearing into the cabin of Jonathan's private jet, while Frank stood on the tarmac, every instinct screaming at him to storm that aircraft and drag his daughter to safety. But Frank Sullivan hadn't survived nearly 3 decades in the military by acting on impulse. He'd learned patience, strategy, and the importance of gathering intelligence before engaging the enemy. And make no mistake, Jonathan Blackwood had just declared himself Frank's enemy. As the jet's engines spooled up for departure, Frank pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Tommy, it's Frank. I need you to run a deeper background check on Jonathan Blackwood. Everything you can find. Finances, legal troubles, previous relationships, and Tommy. Make it priority one." Tommy Rodriguez, chief of security at the airfield and Frank's old Air Force buddy, didn't ask questions. "You got it, Maverick. Anything else?" Frank watched the jet taxi toward the runway, carrying his pregnant daughter away from safety once again. "Yeah," he said grimly. "Call Maggie and tell her we need to have that conversation with Becca tonight, whether she wants it or not. The conversation that might save her life and the life of his unborn grandchild." Margaret Maggie Sullivan had married a fighter pilot, so she thought she knew what controlled strength looked like. But watching her husband pace their kitchen like a caged predator, she realized she'd only seen the surface. "Tell me again what happened," she said, setting a cup of coffee in front of Frank's usual chair. Frank didn't sit. Instead, he stopped at the window overlooking their backyard, his shoulders rigid with tension. He hit her, Maggie, right there in front of everyone, and she took it, made excuses for him. "You said she recognized you. She knows I'm watching now. The question is whether that makes things better or worse for her." Maggie studied her husband's profile, noting the familiar set of his jaw that meant he was planning something tactical. After 5 years of marriage, she'd learned to read the signs of his military mind engaging with a problem. "Frank, you can't approach this like a combat mission." "Can't I?" He turned from the window, and Maggie saw something dangerous flickering in his eyes. "My daughter is being held prisoner by a man who thinks his money makes him untouchable. If that's not enemy territory, what is?" The sound of Frank's phone ringing interrupted her response. He glanced at the caller ID and answered immediately. "What did you find?" Maggie could hear Tommy's voice through the speaker, urgent and concerned. "Frank, you need to sit down for this." "I'm sitting," Frank lied, beginning to pace again. "Jonathan Blackwood isn't just controlling, he's dangerous. I found sealed records from 2 previous relationships. Both women filed restraining orders. Both dropped the charges after receiving substantial financial settlements." Frank's free hand clenched into a fist. "What else?" "He's got gambling debts in 3 states, and his company's under federal investigation for tax fraud. The man's desperate. Frank, desperate men do stupid things." "Any current legal issues?" "That's where it gets interesting. There's a civil suit pending from his business partner, Diana Worthington. Apparently, she claims he's been siphoning money from their joint accounts to cover his gambling losses." Frank absorbed this information with the tactical precision of his military training. Enemy capabilities, financial resources, legal vulnerabilities, all data points that could be exploited. "Tommy, I need you to do something else for me." "Name it." "That security camera system covers the entire tarmac, right including where the incident happened this morning. Every angle, archived for 30 days. Save that footage, and from now on, I want eyes on Blackwood every time he's at the airfield. Can you do that without raising suspicions?" "Consider it done, Maverick." After Frank hung up, Maggie watched him continue his restless pacing. She'd met him when he was already a decorated officer, but she'd heard stories about his early days. The young pilot who'd earned his call sign, Maverick, not for recklessness, but for his ability to think outside standard protocols when lives were on the line. "You're planning something," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm planning several somethings. The question is which plan gives Becca and the baby the best chance of survival." "Survival, Frank? This is domestic abuse, not a war zone." Frank stopped pacing and looked at her with the expression he usually reserved for explaining military tactics to civilians. "Maggie, domestic violence kills more women than combat kills soldiers. The statistics are clear. Pregnancy increases the risk of homicide by 40%. When you add financial pressure and legal troubles to an already violent man." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Maggie had been a nurse long enough to know what domestic violence could escalate to, especially when the abuser felt cornered. "So what's the plan?" she asked. "First, we document everything. Every interaction, every incident, every witness, build an evidence file that can't be dismissed or buried under legal motions. And second, Frank's smile was predatory. Second, I remind Mr. Blackwood that money can't buy everything. Some things have to be earned through blood, sweat, and 28 years of military service. Before Maggie could respond, Frank's phone buzzed with a text message. His expression darkened as he read it. "What is it?" Maggie asked. "Becca. She says they had to make an emergency landing in Jacksonville. She's in the hospital." Maggie was already reaching for her purse. "I'll drive." "No." Frank's voice carried the absolute authority of command. "You stay here in case she calls again. I'm driving down alone." "Frank, Maggie, if I walk into that hospital and find out he hurt her worse than I saw this morning, I need to know you're safe and accounted for, because I won't be responsible for what happens next." The cold certainty in his voice made Maggie's breath catch. This wasn't her husband speaking. This was Colonel Franklin Sullivan, the decorated fighter pilot who'd flown combat missions in 3 different theaters of war. "Just try to remember you're not in uniform anymore," she said softly. Frank paused at the kitchen door, his hand on the keys to his truck. When he looked back at her, his eyes held the hard gleam of a man who'd made a decision. "Maybe it's time I was." 3 hours later, Frank stood in the corridor of Jacksonville Memorial Hospital, still wearing his mechanic's coveralls but carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. Through the partially open door of room 312, he could see his daughter lying in a hospital bed, connected to monitors that tracked both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. Jonathan sat in the visitor's chair, talking animatedly on his phone about rescheduling meetings and managing investors. He hadn't noticed Frank in the hallway, too focused on damage control for his business interests to pay attention to his hospitalized wife. "I don't care what the doctors say," Jonathan was saying into the phone. "We'll be back in Miami by tomorrow morning." "This is just Rebecca being dramatic again." Frank's jaw tightened as he listened. Through the gap in the door, he could see Becca's face, pale, exhausted, and bearing the unmistakable expression of a woman who'd given up fighting. A nurse approached, her soft-soled shoes silent on the linoleum floor. "Are you here to see Mrs. Blackwood?" "I'm her father," Frank said quietly. The nurse's expression softened with sympathy. "She's been asking for family. The pregnancy complications aren't serious, but she's under a lot of stress." "What kind of complications?" "Early contractions, elevated blood pressure. Dr. Mitchell wants to keep her overnight for observation, but..." The nurse glanced toward the room where Jonathan's voice was getting louder. "The husband is insisting they leave." Frank's military training kicked in. Assess the situation, identify the mission parameters, plan the approach. His daughter was in danger, his grandchild was at risk, and the enemy was distracted. Time to engage. Frank watched from the hospital corridor as Jonathan ended his phone call and immediately started another one, never once checking on Becca's condition or acknowledging the medical equipment monitoring their unborn child's distress. "Diana, it's me," Jonathan said into his phone, his voice carrying the peculiar blend of arrogance and desperation that Frank had learned to recognize in men under pressure. "No, I can't make the Miami meeting. Rebecca had one of her episodes." Through the partially open door, Frank saw his daughter flinch at the dismissive term. He'd heard enough. Frank knocked softly and entered the room. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Rebecca Sullivan. I mean, Blackwood." Becca's eyes widened as she saw her father, but she quickly looked away, fear flickering across her features. Jonathan barely glanced up from his phone conversation. "She's sleeping," Jonathan said curtly, waving Frank away. "Come back later." "I'm awake," Becca said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank approached the bed, noting the IV line, the fetal monitor, and the way his daughter instinctively pulled the hospital blanket higher, as if trying to hide. The bruise on her cheek from this morning's slap had darkened to an ugly purple. "I heard you were having some complications," Frank said gently. "How are you feeling?" "Sweetheart?" The endearment slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw Jonathan's attention sharpen. But Becca's eyes filled with tears at hearing her father's caring tone after months of Jonathan's cold indifference. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the response so practiced it sounded rehearsed. "Just some minor issues with the pregnancy." Frank's trained eye took in the medical readouts: elevated heart rate, irregular contractions, stress indicators that painted a picture of a woman and baby in distress. He'd seen similar patterns in combat medics treating soldiers under extreme duress. Minor issues. A new voice joined the conversation as Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered the room, her expression professional but concerned. Mrs. Blackwood is experiencing preterm contractions at 31 weeks. That's not minor. Jonathan finally ended his phone call, his attention now fully focused on the conversation. Doctor, my wife has a tendency toward drama. How soon can she be discharged? Doctor, Mitchell's expression hardened. Mr. Blackwood, your wife needs bed rest and stress reduction. Her blood pressure is dangerously elevated, which puts both her and the baby at risk for serious complications. How serious? Frank asked, stepping closer to Becca's bedside. Preeclampsia, placental abruption, premature delivery, all potentially life-threatening conditions that are exacerbated by stress. Frank felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd lost Becca's mother to complications during childbirth 29 years ago. He wouldn't lose his daughter and grandchild the same way. Then she needs to stay here, Frank said firmly. Jonathan stood up, his body language aggressive. I'm sorry, who are you exactly? Because last I checked, medical decisions for my wife are made by me, not random hospital visitors. I'm her father. Frank's voice carried the quiet authority of command. And I'm not random. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the fetal monitor. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, clearly trying to reconcile the grease-stained mechanic from the airfield with the man now standing beside his wife's hospital bed with unmistakable paternal authority. Frank Sullivan, Jonathan said slowly, recognition dawning. The mechanic from this morning. Retired Colonel Frank Sullivan, United States Air Force, Frank corrected. The mechanic job is just something to keep me busy. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Jonathan's face flushed red as he realized he'd been dismissing and threatening a decorated military officer and his wife's father. You've been spying on me, Jonathan accused. I've been watching out for my daughter. There's a difference. Doctor, Mitchell cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the medical crisis at hand. Regardless of family dynamics, Mrs. Blackwood needs immediate bed rest and stress reduction. The contractions are getting stronger. As if to emphasize the point, Becca suddenly gasped and pressed her hand to her belly as another contraction hit. The fetal monitor began beeping more rapidly. Frank immediately moved to his daughter's side, taking her free hand in his. Breathe, sweetheart, just like we practiced when you were little. Remember, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Our daddy is, she whispered, the childhood name slipping out as pain and fear overwhelmed her carefully constructed defenses. I'm here, Frank said softly. I've got you. Jonathan watched this interaction with growing fury. Don't you think it's a little suspicious that her father shows up right after she has a medical emergency? Maybe he's the one causing her stress. Dr. Mitchell's expression turned icy. Mr. Blackwood, in my 15 years of obstetric medicine, I've learned to recognize the sources of stress in my patients' lives. Right now, I'm looking at the primary source. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Frank felt a surge of satisfaction at the doctor's blunt assessment, but he kept his expression neutral. Medical professionals were mandatory reporters. If Dr. Mitchell had noticed patterns of abuse, she was legally obligated to document them. I want a second opinion, Jonathan snapped, and I want this man removed from the room. The patient has the right to choose her visitors. Dr. Mitchell replied calmly. Mrs. Blackwood, who would you like to have here with you? All eyes turned to Becca, who looked between her husband and her father with obvious anguish. Frank could see the internal war raging, her desire for protection battling against years of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize Jonathan's needs over her own safety. She started, then stopped as another contraction hit. It's okay, Frank said quietly. Whatever you decide, I understand. The gentle permission to choose freely seemed to break something inside her. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her father with desperate eyes. I want my daddy, she whispered. Jonathan's face went white with rage, then red with humiliation. In front of a medical professional and hospital staff, His wife had just chosen her father over him, a public rejection that his narcissistic personality couldn't tolerate. "Fine," he snarled. "Stay here with Daddy, but don't expect me to pay for this little drama session." He stormed toward the door, then turned back for a parting shot. "And don't think this changes anything. Rebecca, you're still my wife, and that's still my baby. I'll be back tomorrow to take you home, whether you like it or not." After Jonathan left, the room felt lighter despite the serious medical situation. Dr. Mitchell checked Becca's monitors and adjusted her medication. "The contractions are slowing down," she announced. "Your blood pressure is already improving." Frank squeezed his daughter's hand gently. "How long has it been this bad?" "Sweetheart." Becca closed her eyes, fresh tears leaking from beneath her lashes. "I don't know anymore. Daddy, it happened so gradually. I didn't realize. And then I was pregnant, and he said no man would want another man's child. And I believed him. And..." She broke down completely then, 29 years of suppressed pain pouring out in harsh sobs. Frank held her hand and let her cry, his own eyes burning with rage at what Jonathan had done to his strong, confident daughter. "It's going to be okay," he said firmly. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." But even as he made the promise, Frank's military mind was already calculating the challenges ahead. Jonathan wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when his pride had been wounded. He had money, lawyers, and a vindictive streak that made him dangerous. The real battle was just beginning. Frank spent the night in the hospital chair beside Becca's bed, maintaining the vigil he'd learned during years of military service, alert even while resting, ready to respond to any threat. Around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Got security footage from the airfield. Also found something interesting about Blackwood's business partner. Call when you can." Frank stepped into the hallway to make the call, keeping one eye on his daughter's room. "What did you find?" he asked quietly when Tommy answered. "First, the good news. We've got clear footage of the assault this morning. Blackwood striking a pregnant woman in front of multiple witnesses. Even his fancy lawyers can't make that disappear. And the interesting news about the business partner, Diana Worthington isn't just suing him for financial fraud. According to my contact at the courthouse, she's also his mistress. Has been for about 2 years, right around the time Becca's marriage started going downhill." Frank absorbed this information with tactical precision. An affair provided motive for increased abuse at home, financial stress from legal battles created desperation, and a vindictive business partner meant Jonathan was fighting a war on multiple fronts. "There's more," Tommy continued. "I did some digging into his gambling debts. He owes serious money to some very serious people in Miami, the kind who don't accept payment plans." "How serious?" "Knee-breaking serious. Maybe worse." Frank felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Jonathan's increasing desperation, his insistence on keeping up appearances with investors, his need to control every aspect of Becca's life. It all pointed to a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "Tommy, I need a favor. Can you reach out to General Morrison?" Tommy whistled softly. "Your old squadron commander, Frank. He's got 3 stars now." "I know, but if anyone can help us navigate this situation through proper channels, it's him." "What are you thinking?" Frank glanced back toward Becca's room, where the morning sun was just beginning to filter through the blinds. "I'm thinking Jonathan Blackwood is about to learn the difference between military justice and civilian courts." 2 hours later, Frank's phone rang with a number he recognized from his Air Force days. "Maverick, this is Red Leader. Tommy filled me in on your situation." General Morrison's voice carried the same calm authority Frank remembered from their squadron days, when Morrison was a captain and Frank was a lieutenant fresh out of flight school. "General, I appreciate you taking my call. Frank, you flew cover for my 6 in Iraq. I'll always take your call. Now tell me about this piece of garbage who's threatening your family." Frank provided a concise briefing, Jonathan's history of violence, the financial crimes under investigation, the escalating threats against a pregnant woman. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally asking tactical questions that reminded Frank why he'd always respected the man's leadership. "Here's what I can do officially." "Nothing," Morrison said when Frank finished. "This is civilian jurisdiction, and we can't interfere with local law enforcement." "I understand, sir. However," Morrison continued, and Frank could hear the slight smile in his voice. I happen to know that Judge Patricia Hamilton in Jacksonville handles domestic violence cases. Her husband was career Navy, lost in action in Afghanistan. She takes a dim view of men who abuse their families. How would one arrange to appear before Judge Hamilton? Hypothetically speaking, if someone were to file for emergency protective orders this morning, and if that someone happened to mention that the respondent had a history of violence and was currently under federal investigation, Judge Hamilton might expedite the hearing. Frank felt a surge of hope. And hypothetically, would military character witnesses be permissible in such hearings? Colonel Sullivan, I believe your service record speaks for itself, as does your daughter's right to protection under Florida law. After ending the call with Morrison, Frank returned to Becca's room to find her awake and staring out the window. The morning light revealed how much weight she'd lost during her pregnancy. Stress and fear had hollowed out her cheeks and darkened the circles under her eyes. "Daddy," she said softly, "are you really going to help me leave him?" Frank pulled the chair closer to her bed and took her hand. "Sweetheart, I'm going to help you do whatever you want to do. If you want to leave him, I'll make sure you're safe. If you want to try to work things out, I can't work things out with someone who hits me," she interrupted, her voice stronger than he'd heard it in months. "I know that now. I think I knew it yesterday, but I was too scared to admit it." "What changed?" Becca placed her free hand on her belly, where their baby was growing. "When I saw you standing up to him yesterday, when I heard you call him out for hurting me, I realized I don't want my daughter to grow up thinking this is normal. I don't want her to marry a man like Jonathan because she thinks that's what love looks like." Frank's throat tightened with emotion. "You're having a daughter. The ultrasound last week showed a girl. Jonathan was furious. He wanted a son to carry on his legacy." She laughed bitterly. "As if his legacy is something worth preserving. What do you want to name her?" For the first time in months, Frank saw a genuine smile cross his daughter's face. "I was thinking about Grace Sullivan, not Grace Blackwood. I want her to have your name, Daddy. I want her to know where she comes from people who protect each other, not people who hurt each other." Frank squeezed her hand gently. "Then let's make sure Grace Sullivan gets the chance to grow up safe and loved." "How?" Frank's expression grew serious. "By teaching her daddy that there are consequences for his actions, and by showing him that money and threats don't work on people who've sworn an oath to defend others." Dr. Mitchell entered the room with Becca's discharge paperwork and a social worker named Janet Chen, whose kind but determined expression suggested she'd dealt with domestic violence cases before. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you'd like to discuss some options for your safety," Janet said. Becca looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, I want to file for divorce and get a restraining order. We can help you with both. There's also a safe house program specifically designed for pregnant women escaping domestic violence." Frank cleared his throat. "With respect, Ms. Chen, my daughter will be staying with me and my wife. Our home is secure, and I have the training and resources to ensure her safety." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "Mr. Sullivan, while family support is wonderful, domestic violence situations require special security considerations." "Ma'am," Frank interrupted politely, "I'm a retired Air Force colonel with 28 years of combat and security experience. I've protected everything from nuclear facilities to heads of state. I think I can handle one abusive civilian." The quiet confidence in his voice left no room for argument. Janet made notes on her paperwork, then looked at Becca. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you comfortable with this arrangement?" "I've never felt safer in my life," Becca said firmly. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Frank's phone buzzed with another message from Tommy. "Blackwood's on his way back. ETA 30 minutes. Suggest alternate exit strategy." Frank showed the message to Dr. Mitchell, who immediately called hospital security. "We'll take you out through the staff exit," she said. "And Mrs. Blackwood, I'm required to report suspected domestic violence cases. Your medical file will be available if needed for legal proceedings." 20 minutes later, Frank helped his daughter into his pickup truck while Tommy's security team kept watch for Jonathan's return. As they drove away from the hospital, Becca leaned back in the passenger seat and closed her eyes. "I can't believe I'm really doing this," she said. "You're not just doing it," Frank replied. You're winning. How can you be so sure? Frank glanced in the rearview mirror, checking for tails with the automatic awareness of his military training. Because this time, you're not fighting alone. Frank's house had never felt more like a military compound. Within 12 hours of bringing Becca home, he'd installed additional security cameras, reinforced the door frames, and established communication protocols with Tommy's security team at the airfield. Maggie had transformed the guest room into a sanctuary, soft lighting, prenatal vitamins on the nightstand, and baby-name books that made Becca cry with gratitude. You don't have to do all this, Becca said, watching her father test the new motion sensors in the backyard. Yes, I do, Frank replied, adjusting the sensitivity settings. This is what families do. We protect each other. The contrast wasn't lost on her. 3 days ago, she'd been walking on eggshells, afraid to breathe too loudly in case it disturbed Jonathan's mood. Now she was eating Maggie's homemade soup while her father turned their home into Fort Knox for her protection. He's going to be furious when he finds out I'm here, she said. Let him be furious. Fury makes people careless. Frank's phone rang, Tommy calling with the daily intelligence update that had become routine. What's the status? Frank answered. Blackwood's been at the airfield 3 times today, ostensibly checking on his aircraft maintenance. Really, he's pumping the staff for information about you. What's he found out? Nothing useful. The guys know to keep their mouths shut. But Frank, there's something else. Diana Worthington showed up this afternoon. Frank's attention sharpened. Jonathan's business partner. What did she want? She asked a lot of questions about security protocols, visitor access, and whether we keep records of who comes and goes. She's gathering intelligence for him. That's what I figured. There's more. I ran her background. She's got connections to some high-end private investigation firms in Miami. The kind that specialize in finding people who don't want to be found. Frank processed this information with tactical precision. Jonathan was escalating from direct confrontation to surveillance and investigation. The next logical step would be legal maneuvering or direct action. Tommy, I need you to implement Protocol 7. There was a pause. Protocol 7 was military terminology they developed for high-threat situations requiring coordinated response. Frank, are you sure that's significant? Do it. And Tommy, make sure our friends in Jacksonville are ready for visitors. After ending the call, Frank found Becca and Maggie in the kitchen, working together to prepare dinner. For a moment, the domestic scene reminded him of better times, before his daughter had married a man who'd systematically destroyed her confidence and joy. Everything okay? Maggie asked, noting his expression. Jonathan's mobilizing resources, private investigators, probably lawyers, maybe worse. Becca's hand went instinctively to her belly. What does that mean? It means he's not accepting the situation, which is what I expected. Frank sat down at the kitchen table, his expression serious. Sweetheart, I need you to understand something. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Men like Jonathan don't give up easily, especially when their pride is wounded. I know, but Daddy, I can't go back to living like that. Even if he promises to change, even if he gets counseling, I can't risk my daughter growing up in that environment. You won't have to, but we need to be smart about this. He has money and connections, which gives him advantages in the civilian world. And we have what? Becca asked. Frank's smile was predatory. We have something money can't buy. People who've sworn oaths to protect and serve, and who take those oaths seriously. The next morning brought validation of Frank's concerns. Becca's phone rang at 7 a.m. Jonathan's lawyer with demands for her immediate return and threats of legal action for parental kidnapping if she didn't comply. Frank listened to the speakerphone conversation with professional interest. The lawyer, Martin Wessex, was clearly experienced in intimidation tactics designed to overwhelm domestic violence victims with legal jargon and threats. Mrs. Blackwood, your husband is prepared to offer substantial financial support in exchange for your cooperation in resolving this matter amicably. I don't want his money, Becca said firmly. I want a divorce and full custody of my child. I'm afraid that's not possible. Mr. Blackwood has substantial parental rights, and frankly, your recent behavior suggests some concerning decision-making patterns. Frank gestured for Becca to mute the phone. He's baiting you. Don't take it. Becca unmuted the call. Mr. Wessex, you can direct all future communications to my attorney. And who might that be? Frank took the phone. Janet Goldman at the Jacksonville Family Law Center. She specializes in domestic violence cases and has an excellent track record against bullying tactics. There was a pause. Who is this? Frank Sullivan. And before you ask, yes, I'm recording this conversation for legal purposes, as is my right under Florida law. The line went dead. Within an hour, Frank's security preparations proved their worth. A black sedan with tinted windows made 3 slow passes by their house, clearly conducting surveillance. Frank photographed the license plate and sent it to Tommy for identification. Private investigation firm out of Miami, Tommy reported back. Registered to Worthington Enterprises. Diana's putting Jonathan's girlfriend to work, Frank observed. It gets better. I did some more digging into her background. Diana Worthington has a history of corporate espionage and what the courts called aggressive business practices. Frank felt pieces of the tactical puzzle sliding into place. Jonathan wasn't just an abusive husband. He was part of a pattern involving financial crime, infidelity, and now possibly criminal conspiracy to harass and intimidate. Tommy, it's time to bring in some friends. Call Morrison and tell him we need a consultation on federal jurisdiction issues. Federal Frank, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that when you combine domestic violence with interstate private investigation harassment, conspiracy to commit fraud, and federal tax charges, this becomes a much bigger case than local family court. And bigger cases get bigger responses? Exactly. That afternoon, Frank was in his workshop when Maggie called out that they had visitors. Through the window, he saw a familiar figure approaching the front door. General Morrison, now in civilian clothes but still carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. General, Frank said, stepping out to greet him. I didn't expect you to come personally. Frank, when one of my pilots tells me his pregnant daughter is being threatened by criminal scumbags, I take a personal interest. Sanon. Morrison's companion was a woman in a severe business suit who radiated the particular kind of authority that came from federal law enforcement. Colonel Sullivan, I'm Special Agent Sarah Chen with the Financial Crimes Division. We've been investigating Mr. Blackwood's business practices for several months. Your daughter's situation may be connected to our ongoing case. Frank felt a surge of tactical satisfaction. Agent Chen, I think we need to have a very detailed conversation. As they moved inside, Frank caught sight of the black sedan making another pass. This time, instead of feeling concerned, he smiled grimly. Jonathan Blackwood had no idea what kind of forces he just provoked. The federal case against Jonathan Blackwood read like a manual on white-collar crime. Agent Chen spread the documents across Frank's dining room table while Becca listened from the living room, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Tax evasion, money laundering, securities fraud. Chen enumerated. We've been building this case for 8 months, but we needed something to break his inner circle of silence. And my daughter's situation provides that opening? Frank asked. Potentially. Domestic violence often accompanies financial crimes. Men who abuse their families are usually abusing their business partners, employees, and clients as well. General Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. What do you need from us? Agent Chen. Mrs. Blackwood's testimony about her husband's behavior, financial control patterns, and any knowledge she might have about his business practices. In exchange, we can offer federal protection and expedited processing of her domestic violence case. Frank looked toward the living room where Becca was pretending to read a magazine while obviously listening to every word. Sweetheart, can you join us? Becca entered slowly, her pregnancy making movement more difficult. At 7.5 months, the stress of the past week had taken a visible toll. Mrs. Blackwood, Agent Chen said gently, I understand this is overwhelming, but your information could help us protect other women from what you've experienced. Other women, your husband has a pattern. The 2 previous relationships we uncovered both involved financial control, isolation, and escalating violence. Both women signed non-disclosure agreements as part of their settlements. Becca's face hardened. You mean I'm not the first? No, and unless we stop him, you won't be the last. Frank watched his daughter process this information. seeing the moment when her protective instincts shifted from just her own child to all the potential future victims. "What do you need to know?" Becca asked. For the next 2 hours, Agent Chen walked Becca through a detailed interview about Jonathan's business practices, financial behavior, and associates. The picture that emerged was damning: systematic fraud, tax evasion, and a network of accomplices, including Diana Worthington. "The gambling debts are the key," Chen explained. "He's been stealing from his own company to pay off bookmakers, then using new investor money to cover the thefts. It's a classic Ponzi scheme." "How much money are we talking about?" General Morrison asked. $12 million, minimum, possibly more. Frank whistled softly. "No wonder he's desperate to maintain control. If this comes out, federal prison, minimum 10 years, asset forfeiture, civil suits from investors, complete financial ruin." The sound of car doors slamming outside made everyone freeze. Frank moved to the window and saw Jonathan's Bentley in the driveway, accompanied by 2 other expensive cars. "He brought backup," Frank observed calmly. Agent Chen was already on her radio, calling for federal backup, while General Morrison stepped to the other window to assess the tactical situation. "Frank," Morrison said quietly, "3 men approaching the front door, all in expensive suits. One's carrying what looks like legal documents." Frank's military instincts engaged immediately. "Maggie, take Becca to the back bedroom. Agent Chen, I assume you're armed always?" The doorbell rang, followed immediately by aggressive pounding. Frank opened the door with Agent Chen visible behind him, her federal credentials displayed prominently. "Mr. Sullivan," the lead attorney said, "I'm Martin Wessex, representing Jonathan Blackwood. We have a court order requiring you to produce Rebecca Blackwood immediately." Frank examined the document with the careful attention to detail his military training had ingrained. "This is a temporary custody order from Miami-Dade County. We're in Duval County, Florida. Your jurisdiction ends about 300 miles south of here. The order is valid statewide. Agent Chen, would you like to examine this document?" Agent Chen stepped forward, her federal credentials making the 3 men step back involuntarily. "FBI Financial Crimes Division. This order appears to be based on fraudulent representations to the court." "That's a serious accusation," Wessex said, but Frank noticed uncertainty creeping into his voice. "It's also accurate," Chen replied calmly. "Mr. Blackwood failed to disclose to the Miami court that he's currently under federal investigation, that his wife has filed domestic violence charges in Jacksonville, and that he violated a restraining order by coming here." Wessex looked confused. "What restraining order?" Frank smiled grimly. "The one that was served this morning. Judge Hamilton was very interested in Mr. Blackwood's history of violence against pregnant women." "Foi noir." The second attorney whispered something urgent in Wessex's ear, probably about the legal implications of violating a federal restraining order while under financial crimes investigation. "Where's Jonathan?" Frank asked. "In the car," Wessex admitted. "Bring him up here. Agent Chen has some questions for him." 5 minutes later, Jonathan Blackwood stood on Frank's front porch, his usual arrogance replaced by barely controlled panic. He looked like a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. "Rebecca," he called toward the house, "stop this nonsense and come home. We can work this out." Frank stepped closer, his military bearing making Jonathan instinctively step back. "Mr. Blackwood, you're in violation of a federal restraining order. Agent Chen here would be well within her rights to arrest you right now." "You can't intimidate me, old man. I have rights." "You had rights," Agent Chen corrected. "Right up until you decided to commit federal crimes and beat pregnant women?" Jonathan's face went white as he realized the full scope of what he was facing. "I want to speak to my wife." "Your soon-to-be ex-wife doesn't want to speak to you," Frank replied. "In fact, she's been very helpful in providing information about your business practices to the FBI." The mention of Becca's cooperation with federal investigators broke something in Jonathan's composure. "You turned her against me. You poisoned her mind." "I didn't have to turn her against you," Frank said quietly. "You did that yourself the first time you hit her." Jonathan lunged forward, his rage overriding his common sense. Frank didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even shift his weight. He simply stood there with the absolute stillness of a man who'd faced far more dangerous enemies and survived. Jonathan stopped inches from Frank's face, suddenly aware that he was threatening a decorated combat veteran in front of federal agents and multiple witnesses. "This isn't over," he snarled. Frank's smile was cold and predatory. "Yes, it is. You just haven't realized it yet." As Jonathan and his legal team retreated to their cars, Agent Chen turned to Frank with professional admiration. "Colonel Sullivan, that was textbook threat de-escalation. Most civilians would have either backed down or escalated to violence." "Agent Chen, most civilians haven't spent 30 years learning the difference between looking dangerous and being dangerous." Through the window, Frank could see Becca watching from the bedroom, her hand pressed to the glass. When their eyes met, she smiled for the first time in days, not the brittle, fearful expression she'd worn around Jonathan, but the genuine happiness he remembered from her childhood. His daughter was finally free. Now all he had to do was make sure she stayed that way. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed once Becca agreed to cooperate fully. Within 48 hours of Agent Chen's visit, Jonathan's business accounts were frozen. His assets were under court protection, and Diana Worthington had been arrested for conspiracy and money laundering. Frank stood in his kitchen, reading the morning news on his tablet while Maggie prepared breakfast for Becca, who was finally eating with something approaching normal appetite. "Miami businessman arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme," Frank read aloud. "Authorities cite domestic violence charges as key evidence in establishing pattern of criminal behavior." "They really think that will stick?" Becca asked, settling carefully into her chair as her pregnancy reached its final month. "Agent Chen seems confident. Apparently, financial criminals often display similar control patterns in their personal relationships. Your testimony about how Jonathan controlled your money, isolated you from friends, and monitored your activities fits the same psychological profile they see in corporate fraud cases." Becca's phone rang. Their lawyer, Janet Goldman, with an update on the divorce proceedings. "Becca, I have good news and interesting news," Janet said through the speaker. "The good news is that Jonathan's criminal charges are making your divorce case much simpler. The court is inclined to grant everything you've requested. And the interesting news, Diana Worthington wants to meet with you. She's apparently willing to provide additional evidence against Jonathan in exchange for testimony, supporting her claim that she was also a victim of his manipulation." Frank and Becca exchanged glances. The woman who'd been Jonathan's business partner and mistress now wanted to present herself as another victim. "What kind of evidence?" Frank asked. "Financial records showing systematic theft from their business accounts, documentation of Jonathan's gambling debts, and communications proving he threatened her when she tried to end their relationship." "So she's throwing him under the bus to save herself?" Becca observed. "Essentially, yes. But her evidence could ensure he goes to prison for a long time." After ending the call, Frank sat down across from his daughter. "What do you think? I think I want to hear what she has to say. If Jonathan did to her what he did to me, then maybe she really is another victim. And if she's not..." Becca's expression hardened with the strength Frank remembered from her childhood, before Jonathan had systematically destroyed her confidence. "Then I'll know that too." The meeting was arranged for the next afternoon at Janet's law office, with Agent Chen present to ensure all evidence was properly documented. Frank accompanied Becca, ostensibly for moral support, but really because his tactical instincts insisted on assessing Diana Worthington personally. Diana was everything Becca was not: polished, calculating, and radiating the kind of predatory confidence that came from years of corporate manipulation. She wore an expensive suit that managed to look both professional and subtly seductive, and her handshake lingered just long enough to be inappropriate. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm so sorry for what Jonathan put you through," Diana said with perfect sincerity. "I had no idea he was abusing you at home." Frank watched his daughter's face carefully, noting the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested skepticism. "But you knew he was stealing money from your business?" Becca asked. "I suspected, but I couldn't prove it until recently. Jonathan was very careful about covering his tracks." Agent Chen leaned forward. "Miss Worthington, you were also having an affair with Mr. Blackwood. How did that relationship begin?" Diana's composure flickered slightly. "Jonathan pursued me aggressively. He said his marriage was over in all but name, that you were mentally unstable and refusing to give him a divorce." Becca's hands clenched into fists. Mentally unstable. I didn't know it was a lie until I saw how he treated you at the airfield that day. No mentally unstable woman would have shown the strength you did in that situation. Frank spoke for the first time. Ms. Worthington, you were present when my daughter was publicly humiliated and physically threatened by your business partner. What was your reaction? Diana's eyes narrowed slightly as she evaluated Frank's question. She was clearly trying to gauge how much they knew about her role in encouraging Jonathan's behavior. I was shocked, she said finally. Shocked enough to intervene. No. I was afraid he might turn violent toward me as well. Frank's expression remained neutral, but internally he was cataloging inconsistencies. Diana Worthington wasn't afraid of anyone. She was a woman who'd built a career on manipulation and calculated risks. Her claim of fear didn't match her psychological profile. Ms. Worthington, Becca said quietly, when you and Jonathan were together, did he ever hit you? Not physically, but he was controlling, possessive. He threatened my business interests when I tried to end our relationship, but he never actually struck you. No, Becca nodded slowly. Then you don't know what I went through. You don't know what it's like to live in constant fear, to walk on eggshells, to explain away bruises and make excuses for someone who's supposed to love you. Diana's carefully constructed sympathy began to crack. I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, Becca interrupted. I'm done. Done with Jonathan. Done with his lies, and done with people who enabled his behavior. Agent Chen consulted her notes. Ms. Worthington, security footage from the airfield shows you encouraging Mr. Blackwood's confrontation with Mrs. Blackwood. You're heard saying, maybe she needs to learn some respect. The room fell silent. Diana's mask of victimhood slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator underneath. That was taken out of context, Diana said finally. Frank leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Worthington, in my experience, context usually makes things clearer, not more confusing. I made mistakes, Diana admitted, but I'm willing to cooperate fully with the investigation. Because you're facing federal charges, Agent Chen observed. Your cooperation isn't altruistic, it's self-preservation. Does it matter why I'm cooperating, as long as Jonathan goes to prison? Becca spoke before anyone else could respond. Yes, it matters. Because if we let you pretend to be a victim when you were really an accomplice, then we're saying that what happened to me doesn't matter, that the threats, the fear, the isolation were just collateral damage in your business relationship. Diana's composure cracked completely. You think you're so moral, so pure, but you stayed with him for 3 years. You took his money, lived in his house, played the perfect wife at his business functions? If you really hated it so much, why didn't you leave? The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Frank felt his protective instincts surge, but Becca held up a hand to stop him from intervening. Because he convinced me I was worthless, Becca said quietly. Because he isolated me from my family and friends. Because he controlled every aspect of my financial life. Because he told me no other man would want a broken woman like me. And because I was carrying his child and believed his threats about what would happen if I tried to leave. She stood up, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her dignity intact. That's the difference between us. Diana, I was a victim who found the strength to become a survivor. You were never a victim at all. You were just another predator who got caught. As they left the law office, Frank put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. I'm proud of you, he said simply. For what? For seeing through her manipulation, for refusing to let her rewrite the narrative, for being stronger than either of them ever gave you credit for. Becca leaned against her father's steady presence. Daddy, do you think Jonathan will really go to prison? Frank's smile was grimly satisfied. Sweetheart, between the federal charges, the domestic violence evidence, and Diana's documentation of his financial crimes, Jonathan Blackwood is going to have a very long time to think about the consequences of his choices. Good, Becca said firmly. Maybe the next woman won't have to go through what I did. As they drove home, Frank reflected on the tactical situation. Jonathan was effectively neutralized, facing federal charges, financially ruined, and legally prohibited from contacting Becca. Diana's cooperation would ensure his conviction, regardless of her motives. The mission was nearly complete. His daughter was safe, his grandchild was protected, and justice was being served. But Frank Sullivan had learned during 30 years of military service that the most dangerous time in any operation was right before mission completion, when overconfidence could lead to fatal mistakes. He wasn't ready to declare victory yet. Frank's caution proved justified 3 days later when Tommy called with urgent news. "Frank, we've got a problem. Jonathan made bail." Frank felt ice settle in his stomach. How is that possible? Agent Chen said the charges were serious enough to deny bail. His lawyers found a technicality in the federal paperwork. Plus, Diana Worthington posted his bond. "Diana, I thought she was cooperating with the prosecution. Apparently, she's playing both sides." Tommy's voice was grim. "Frank, there's more. He's not responding to attempts at contact, and his phone is going straight to voicemail. My sources at the Miami PD say he cleared out his apartment yesterday." Frank absorbed this information with tactical precision. Jonathan was free, unaccounted for, facing financial ruin and prison time, with nothing left to lose. In military terms, he'd become a broken arrow, an uncontrolled asset with potential for maximum damage. "Tommy, implement Protocol 8 immediately. Full security lockdown. Everything. And contact Agent Chen. She needs to know her star witness just became a flight risk." Frank hung up and found Becca in the nursery, folding tiny clothes with the peaceful expression of a woman preparing for new life. The contrast between her serene domestic activity and the danger now approaching made his protective instincts surge. "Sweetheart, we need to talk." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. "What's wrong?" Frank closed the door and activated the signal jamming device he'd installed, a military-grade unit that would prevent electronic surveillance. "Jonathan made bail. He's unaccounted for, possibly on the run." Becca's hand went instinctively to her belly. At 36 weeks pregnant, she was vulnerable in ways that made Frank's tactical calculations increasingly complex. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we go to full defensive protocols until he's recaptured. No leaving the house without escort, all communications monitored, and emergency procedures in place." "Daddy, you're scaring me." Frank knelt beside her chair, his expression softening. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to keep you safe. Men like Jonathan don't usually run. They usually lash out at whoever they blame for their problems. And he blames me. He blames all of us. But mostly, he blames me for taking away his control over you." As if summoned by their conversation, Maggie appeared in the doorway with Frank's secure phone. "Agent Chen calling on the emergency line." Frank took the call, listening intently to Agent Chen's update. When he hung up, his expression was grim. Jonathan's passport was flagged at Miami International Airport, but by the time federal agents arrived, he was gone. They found his rental car in long-term parking. "So he could be anywhere," Becca said, "or he could be on his way here. Agent Chen is sending a protective detail, but it'll take them 4 hours to get into position." Frank's tactical mind was already calculating response scenarios. 4 hours was a significant vulnerability window, especially if Jonathan had resources they weren't aware of. "Maggie, take Becca to the safe room. I'm going to make some calls." The safe room was actually Frank's workshop, reinforced with steel plating and equipped with communication equipment, medical supplies, and defensive weapons. It was designed to withstand anything short of military-grade assault. While Becca and Maggie secured themselves, Frank contacted his Air Force network. Within 30 minutes, 3 of his old squadron mates were en route to provide additional security. Tommy was coordinating with local law enforcement, and General Morrison was applying federal pressure to expedite the manhunt. But Frank's instincts told him they were already too late to prevent Jonathan from making his play. The attack came at sunset, announced by the sound of expensive car engines in Frank's usually quiet neighborhood. Through his security monitors, he could see 2 black SUVs taking position at either end of his street, blocking escape routes with professional precision. "Mercenaries," Frank observed calmly, speaking into his radio. "Tommy, are you seeing this?" "Affirmative. My team is en route. ETA 8 minutes. Federal backup, 12 minutes out." Frank's military experience told him that 12 minutes was an eternity in a tactical situation. Whatever Jonathan was planning, it would be over long before official help arrived. The front door chime announced visitors. Frank checked his monitors and saw Jonathan standing on his porch, flanked by two men who radiated professional violence despite their business suits. Frank activated his external speaker system. "Jonathan, you're in violation of federal restraining orders and parole conditions. Leave immediately." "I want to talk to my wife," Jonathan called back. "Just talk. Give me 5 minutes to explain." "No? Then I'm coming in." Frank watched through his monitors as one of Jonathan's companions produced what looked like sophisticated door-breaching equipment. These weren't random thugs. They were professionals with military or law enforcement training. Frank keyed his radio. "Maggie, prepare for breach. Standard defensive positions." In the safe room, Maggie helped Becca into body armor specially designed for pregnant women, while Frank activated his home's defensive systems. Motion-activated lights flooded the property. Security cameras began recording to off-site servers, and silent alarms notified every law enforcement agency in North Florida. The front door exploded inward with professional efficiency. Frank, positioned at the top of the stairs with clear fields of fire, watched three figures move through his living room with tactical precision. "Rebecca," Jonathan called out, "I know you're here. Let's end this reasonably." Frank's voice echoed through the house's intercom system. "Jonathan, you have 30 seconds to leave before I exercise my legal right to defend my family. You can't hide behind legal technicalities forever. Old man, I'm not hiding behind anything. I'm standing right here." Jonathan looked up toward the second floor, finally spotting Frank's position at the head of the stairs. Even at that distance, Frank could see the desperation and rage warring in the younger man's expression. "You destroyed my life," Jonathan accused. "You destroyed your own life. I just protected my daughter from going down with you. She's my wife. That's my baby. You have no right to interfere." Frank's response was quiet but carried clearly through the house. "I have every right to protect my family from threats. It's what fathers do." Jonathan started up the stairs, flanked by his hired muscle. Frank remained motionless, his military bearing making it clear he was prepared for whatever came next. "Last warning. Jonathan, turn around and leave, or what you'll shoot me in front of witnesses." Frank's smile was cold and predatory. "Jonathan, you broke into my home with armed companions to threaten my pregnant daughter. In Florida, that's called home invasion, and the legal standard for deadly force is pretty clear." The confidence in Frank's voice seemed to penetrate Jonathan's rage-fueled desperation. For the first time, he appeared to realize the tactical situation he'd created, trapped in an armed veteran's house, with federal agents en route, having committed multiple felonies in front of recording devices. "You're bluffing," Jonathan said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Try me." The sound of approaching sirens made everyone freeze. Jonathan's hired muscle immediately stepped back, professional self-preservation overriding their contractual obligations. "Sir, we need to leave," one of them said urgently. "Now." But Jonathan's desperation had pushed him beyond rational decision-making. Instead of retreating, he pulled a handgun from inside his jacket, a move that instantly transformed the situation from tense confrontation to active threat. Frank's military training took over. In one fluid motion, he dropped behind cover and acquired his own weapon, a combat shotgun that he'd carried through 2 decades of military service. "Armed threat in the house," he said calmly into his radio. "Engaging." The next few seconds would determine whether his daughter and grandchild lived or died. Frank's tactical training engaged with crystalline clarity. Jonathan with a handgun, 2 hired mercenaries pulling back toward the exit, sirens approaching from multiple directions, and his pregnant daughter in the safe room below. Mission parameters neutralize the immediate threat without collateral damage. "Jonathan, put the weapon down," Frank commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This ends badly for everyone if you don't." It already ended badly, Jonathan shouted, his gun wavering as desperation overwhelmed tactical sense. "You destroyed everything. My business, my marriage, my reputation. You did that yourself. I just made sure my daughter survived it." Through his peripheral vision, Frank could see the 2 mercenaries making strategic withdrawals toward the damaged front door. Professional operators knew when a situation had deteriorated beyond salvage. "Sir, we're leaving," one called to Jonathan. "This wasn't part of our contract." "Get back here," Jonathan screamed, but his hired muscle had already disappeared into the night, leaving him alone in Frank's house with a weapon he clearly didn't know how to use properly. Frank's radio crackled with Tommy's voice. "Maverick, federal agents are on scene. They're requesting you maintain position and await tactical team deployment." "Negative," Frank replied calmly. "Pregnant woman in the house. Armed subject in immediate proximity. I'm resolving this now." Frank rose from cover, his shotgun trained on Jonathan but not in an immediately threatening position. His military bearing was unmistakable, a predator who'd chosen to show restraint rather than weakness. "Jonathan, look at me," Frank said. "Really look. You're holding a gun on a decorated combat veteran in his own home. How do you think this ends?" Jonathan's weapon hand was shaking now, fear finally penetrating his rage-fueled desperation. I just want my wife back. She was never yours to begin with. You don't own people. Jonathan, you never did. I gave her everything: money, clothes, a beautiful home. You gave her a prison with expensive decorations." Frank took a step closer, his tactical assessment complete. Jonathan was emotionally compromised, physically exhausted, and holding his weapon incorrectly. Not an immediate threat to someone with Frank's training. The only thing you never gave her was what she actually needed, which was what? Safety, respect, the right to make her own choices. Through the house's intercom system, Becca's voice suddenly echoed from the safe room below. "Jonathan, stop." Everyone froze. Frank's daughter had activated the communication system, her voice carrying clearly through the house despite the physical barriers protecting her. "Rebecca," Jonathan called out, his attention diverted from Frank for a crucial moment. "I'm here. Jonathan, I can hear everything you're saying." Frank remained motionless, recognizing his daughter's tactical instinct. By engaging Jonathan directly, she was giving Frank positional advantage while potentially de-escalating the emotional component of the threat. "Come out," Jonathan pleaded. "Let's talk about this reasonably." "I can't do that, Jonathan, not anymore." "Because of him," Jonathan gestured wildly toward Frank, his weapon discipline completely abandoned. "Because of you, because of what you did to me, to us, to our marriage." Frank watched Jonathan's body language carefully, noting the moment when desperate hope began shifting toward final rage. It was the most dangerous moment in any confrontation, when the aggressor realized that negotiation had failed and violence was the only remaining option. "If I can't have you," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to something cold and final, "then no one can." He raised the handgun toward the ceiling, clearly intending to shoot through the floor toward the safe room where Becca was positioned. Frank moved. 30 years of military training compressed into 2 seconds of perfect execution. Frank closed the distance between them, used his shotgun to deflect Jonathan's aim, and drove the younger man face first into the hardwood floor with precisely applied force. The handgun skittered away across the floor, leaving Jonathan gasping and disarmed beneath Frank's knee. "Federal agents, we're coming in." Agent Chen's voice echoed through the house as tactical officers swarmed through the broken front door. Frank remained in position, controlling Jonathan until the professionals could secure the scene. "Subject is secured," Frank reported calmly. "Weapon is clear. No shots fired." As federal agents took custody of Jonathan, Frank finally allowed himself to breathe normally. The tactical situation was resolved. His family was safe, and justice would finally be served. "Daddy," Becca's voice came through the intercom. "All clear, sweetheart. It's over." 15 minutes later, Frank stood in his living room surveying the damage while paramedics checked Becca and confirmed that both she and the baby were unharmed. Jonathan was in federal custody, facing charges that would likely result in decades in prison. Agent Chen approached Frank with professional admiration. "Colonel Sullivan, that was textbook threat neutralization. Minimal force, no collateral damage, subject secured without injury." "Agent Chen, that was a father protecting his family. The military training just made it more efficient. Still, we'll need a full debrief for our reports." Frank nodded, watching as Becca emerged from the safe room with Maggie's support. Despite everything she'd been through, his daughter looked stronger than she had in months, as if finally standing up to her abuser had restored something vital that had been taken from her. "Daddy," she said, moving carefully toward him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that I was worth fighting for. That my baby was worth fighting for. That some things are more important than money or status or keeping peace? Frank embraced his daughter gently, mindful of her pregnancy and the stress she'd endured. Sweetheart, you always had that strength. You just needed to remember it. Will he really go to prison? Agent Chen answered before Frank could respond. Mrs. Blackwood, your husband is looking at federal charges for home invasion, assault with a deadly weapon, violation of federal restraining orders, and conspiracy. Combined with the financial crimes we've already documented, he'll likely spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Good, Becca said firmly. Maybe the next woman won't have to go through this. As the federal agents finished their work and the house gradually emptied of law enforcement personnel, Frank found himself alone with his family for the first time in days. The immediate crisis was over, but the work of healing would take much longer. So what happens now? Becca asked. Frank looked around his damaged living room, then at his daughter's determined face, and finally at Maggie's supportive smile. Now we rebuild, he said simply. We fix what's broken, we prepare for new life, and we move forward together. Through the broken front door, Frank could see the first hints of dawn on the horizon. After the longest night of their lives, morning had finally come. 6 weeks after Jonathan's arrest, Rebecca Grace Sullivan entered the world at Jacksonville Memorial Hospital, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces of perfect, healthy determination. Frank held his granddaughter for the first time in the same delivery room where Becca had spent the night hiding from her abusive husband, and the contrast wasn't lost on anyone present. She's got your eyes, sweetheart, Frank said softly, studying the tiny face that already showed signs of the Sullivan family's stubborn streak. And your chin, Becca replied, exhausted but genuinely happy for the first time in years. Poor little thing doesn't know what she's in for. Maggie bustled around the room, photographing everything with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd waited 5 years to become a grandmother. Frank, you need to sit down before you drop her. I'm not going to drop her. I've held babies before. That was 30 years ago, and Becca was a lot bigger when you finally worked up the courage to pick her up. Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered with discharge paperwork and the satisfied expression of an obstetrician whose patient had delivered safely, despite serious complications throughout the pregnancy. How are we feeling? Mom, she asked Becca, like I could sleep for a week, but also like I could run a marathon. Is that normal? Completely normal. The important thing is that both you and Grace are healthy. Dr. Mitchell's expression grew more serious. Becca, I want you to know that your medical records have been sealed under federal witness protection protocols. Your ex-husband's legal team can't access them, and any future custody proceedings will be handled through federal court. What about his parental rights? Becca asked, the question that had been haunting her throughout the pregnancy. Agent Chen, who had become a regular presence in their lives over the past month, spoke from the doorway. Mrs. Blackwood, I have good news. Jonathan Blackwood pled guilty to all charges yesterday. Part of his plea agreement includes termination of parental rights. Frank looked up sharply. He agreed to that. His lawyer convinced him it was his only chance of avoiding a life sentence. With his cooperation in the federal case, he'll be eligible for parole in 25 years instead of never. Becca closed her eyes with relief. So Grace will never have to know him. Not unless you decide otherwise when she's an adult. But legally, he has no claim to her. The weight that Becca had carried for months finally lifted. Her daughter would grow up free from the shadow of her biological father's violence and manipulation. There's something else, Agent Chen continued. Diana Worthington was sentenced this morning. 12 years for conspiracy, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The judge was particularly harsh because of her role in encouraging domestic violence. Frank felt a grim satisfaction. Justice had been served comprehensively, not just for his family, but for all the other women who might have been Jonathan's future victims. Over the next few days, the Sullivan household adapted to the rhythms of new parenthood. Frank discovered that his military precision was perfectly suited to nighttime feedings and diaper changes, while Maggie's nursing background made her invaluable for everything from swaddling techniques to identifying the subtle differences in Grace's various cries. You're a natural at this grandpa thing, Becca observed, watching Frank rock Grace with the same calm competence he'd brought to everything else in his military career. It's just tactical planning with smaller equipment. Frank replied, adjusting Grace's position with practiced ease. Same principles apply. Assess the situation, identify the objectives, execute the mission. And what's the mission objective? Frank's expression softened as he looked down at his granddaughter. Keep this little warrior safe and happy until she's old enough to fight her own battles. Thinks she'll want to be a pilot like her grandfather. She'll want to be whatever makes her happy. But if she chooses aviation, I'll make sure she gets the best training available. 2 weeks after Grace's birth, Tommy stopped by with news from the airfield. Frank, management wants to know when you're coming back to work. Frank looked around his living room, where Becca was napping on the couch while Grace slept in her carrier nearby. Maggie was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself. It was the most peaceful his house had been in months. I'm thinking about retiring from the mechanic job, Frank said. I've got more important things to focus on now. I like what, Frank gestured toward his sleeping daughter and granddaughter. Like being exactly where my family needs me to be. Tommy smiled. You know, for a guy who spent 30 years in the Air Force, you've adapted pretty well to civilian life. Tommy, I spent 30 years learning how to complete missions and protect people. This is just a different kind of mission. And how's this mission going? Frank looked at his daughter, who was sleeping without fear for the first time in years. He looked at his granddaughter, who would grow up knowing she was loved and protected. He looked at Maggie, who had embraced her expanded family with characteristic generosity and strength. Mission accomplished, he said quietly. That evening, as Frank took his turn with Grace's late feeding, he carried her to the window overlooking their backyard. The same yard where he'd installed security systems and planned defensive strategies now seemed peaceful in the moonlight. You know what, little one, he said softly, adjusting Grace's blanket. Your mama thinks I rescued her from your daddy, but the truth is, she rescued herself. She just needed someone to believe she was worth fighting for. Grace made a small sound that might have been agreement. And you, Miss Grace Sullivan, you're going to grow up knowing exactly what you're worth. You're going to know that real strength isn't about controlling people, it's about protecting them. You're going to know that love isn't supposed to hurt, and respect isn't something you have to earn by being perfect. Frank paused, thinking about the lessons he wanted to pass on to his granddaughter. Most importantly, you're going to know that if anyone ever tries to hurt you or make you feel small, you've got a family that will move heaven and earth to keep you safe. As if sensing the gravity of her grandfather's promises, Grace opened her eyes and looked up at him with the alert expression of someone taking everything in. That's right, Frank said with a smile. You're a Sullivan now, and Sullivans take care of each other. 3 months later, Becca had found her own apartment and was preparing to return to work part-time. Frank helped her move her things, noting with satisfaction how different she looked from the broken woman he'd encountered at the airfield nearly a year ago. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked, loading Grace's crib into his truck. Daddy, I was ready months ago. I just needed to remember that I could be, and if you need anything, I'll call. But Frank Sullivan, you raised me to be independent once, and you've helped me remember how to be independent again. Grace and I are going to be fine. Frank knew she was right. His daughter had reclaimed her strength, her confidence, and her future. His mission was complete, but as he watched Becca buckle Grace into her car seat for the drive to their new home, Frank realized that some missions never really ended. Being a father, being a grandfather, being the person his family could count on, that was a lifetime assignment, and Colonel Franklin Sullivan had never failed to complete a mission yet. 6 months later, Frank received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Prisons informing him that Jonathan Blackwood had been transferred to a maximum security facility in Colorado, where he would serve his sentence far from Florida and any possibility of threatening Frank's family. He showed the letter to Becca during their weekly Sunday dinner. How do you feel about that? He asked. Becca, who was feeding Grace mashed bananas while the baby tried to grab the spoon, considered the question seriously. I feel free, she said finally. For the first time since I married him, I feel completely free. Any regrets? Only that it took me so long to ask for help, and that I put Grace at risk by staying as long as I did. Frank reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. Sweetheart, you did what you thought you had to do to survive. Nobody gets to judge those choices except you. Even so, I want Grace to grow up knowing she never has to settle for someone who treats her badly. I want her to know the difference between love and control. She'll know. She's got good teachers. As if summoned by the conversation, Grace chose that moment to successfully grab the spoon and fling banana puree across the kitchen, laughing with delight at her achievement. And apparently, she's already showing signs of the Sullivan independence streak, Becca observed, wiping banana off her shirt. Frank laughed, thinking about his granddaughter's bright future. Grace would grow up surrounded by love, protected by family, and taught that she had value simply by existing. She would never doubt her worth or accept treatment that diminished her dignity. Most importantly, she would grow up knowing that when life got difficult, she had a grandfather who was a fighter pilot, a father who would never let her down, and a family legacy of protecting the people who mattered most. You know what I think, Frank said, helping clean banana off the high chair. What's that? I think little Grace is going to change the world someday. How can you be so sure? Frank smiled, watching his granddaughter attempt to feed herself with determined concentration. Because she's already changed ours. Outside, the sun was setting over Jacksonville, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds that reminded Frank of his flying days. But those days of soaring through clouds and defending distant territories seemed less important now than the quiet domestic mission of raising strong women and building a family legacy of love and protection. Colonel Franklin Sullivan had flown combat missions over 3 continents, earned medals for valor, and served his country with distinction for nearly 3 decades. But sitting in his kitchen, watching his daughter laugh while his granddaughter painted herself with baby food, Frank realized this was the most important mission of his life, and he'd completed it with the same precision, dedication, and success that had defined his military career. Mission accomplished.